Good evening and good morning to those in Asia who are joining us. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I am the director of the Indo-Pacific program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thanks again for joining us. Tonight's discussion is going to be looking at China's coercive diplomacy and how a range of different actors, including Canada, can work together to address these challenges. So I think on the mind of many Canadians, obviously, is the events of the past few weeks. I think I can echo the voices of many Canadians to say we're overjoyed to have both Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor back home on Canadian soil where they belong with their families. But I think the flip side of this is the manner in which things happened with the deferred prosecution agreement with Meng Wanzhou and then the return of the Michaels. So while it's fantastic to have both of the Michaels home, I think that most in the expert class, and I think that I have to ask my fellow panelists whether this is the case with them as well, but if you would have asked them, how long would it be until Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor returned, might have said 3, 4, 5, 6 months. But the fact that they came back immediately, I think is a positive development on one side, but also represents something very dark about the way China has viewed this entire incident. And I think for Canadians, it sort of justifies the point that we've been thinking all along, that essentially these cases were very much interlinked. But I think the issue with the two Michaels is just one element of this. The reality is that this is just one element of China's coercive diplomacy. And while Canada has felt the brunt of this in recent months, obviously, and this has been on front row of display, this has been something that others in the region have been facing for some time. So we've got an all-star panel here from all across the region. This has been something that others in the region have been facing. And I wanted to introduce them so that they could provide some of their insights. And we're going to have a discussion here on the different elements of coercive diplomacy and most importantly, how Canada can work with its international partners to manage these risks. So first, I'm going to start off with just some initial comments from some of those who have joined the discussion tonight. And then we're going to move on to a discussion on this topic. So if I can start initially with Dr. Tom Wilkins, who's a good friend of mine, and I'm going to start with Tom because he's the farthest away. He's joining us all the way from Sydney, Australia. And Tom is a senior research fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, a partner with me at JIIA, and also a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney. So Tom, can I start off with you and just get a few of your perspectives from Australia, because Australia, in addition to being a key ally to Canada, a member of the Five Eyes, a common member of NATO, also has been dealing with quite a combative relationship with China, and I think is front of mind when it comes to coercive diplomacy. So I wonder if you can give us a few of your insights, first of all, on the Australian experience, but also on your reactions to the most recent episode here in Canada with the two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou, and whether you have any advice for the Canadians.
So, yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan, for organising this. Well, I mean, the first thing to note is that, Australia has been watching this very closely, the so-called hostage diplomacy, and thankfully the release of the two Michaels. But while it's a lot less high profile, we actually have two Australian citizens detained in China ourselves. One is a media personality, and the other one, I think, is possibly an academic, but perhaps involved in democracy advocacy. So we have those two slightly less high-profile cases of our own to deal with. So we are watching closely what's happened here. It seems, unfortunately, we don't have a high-profile chief financial officer to trade for them at the moment. But how we'll work that out with sort of back-channel diplomacy remains to be seen. Perhaps I'll just mention the context of Australia's position just as an opener, and then I can give you the sort of the details of the ins and outs of how Australia has dealt with coercive diplomacy, the details and the responses when you come back to me in the discussion. So for the audience, it's probably just important to recognise what Australia's position is, or what it has been up until now, before I go into more detail later. So we have obviously very heavy trade dependence upon China. About something between about 25 to 30% of our trade flows are with China. And so we're very, very vulnerable to these levers of economic statecraft emanating from Beijing. Now, analysts had argued for a long time that any Australian foreign policy behaviour that Beijing didn't like on Australia's part, particularly support for the United States and the US alliance, but also especially there was a debate focused around closer security ties with Japan, because Australia has built this special strategic partnership with Japan and become a very close become very closely aligned with Japan on security and diplomatic issues, and that this would bring down economic punishment in return. There's been some very sort of vociferous debates about this in the past, and sort of just waiting for this to happen. But the official government line was really that we could compartmentalize our security relationships, chiefly with the United States, and also our new security partnership with Japan. And we could compartmentalize that from the benefits of close economic interdependence with China. So the mantra had been, up until recent years, that we don't need to choose between supporting our security ally and still enjoying these trade benefits from China, and that these things would never come into conflict. But this was always a little bit of a charade, and not necessarily for us to decide, given that we're sort of the piggy in the middle for this. And so, of course, more recently, the situation has changed. The more that we've done to provoke China has led to the situation that we're in now. So I know that these are opening marks, so I'll just leave that there as context before going into the details in the discussion. But it's certainly true that Australia is closely watching what has happened with the so-called hostage diplomacy and Canada's experience. And I think, as both being members of the Five Eyes as well, there's a lot that these countries can do to kind of cooperate on mitigation strategies and share information and intelligence on matters of coercion and the use of economic statecraft by China. So I'll leave my opening remarks there and then speak a little more about the current situation and the details in the discussion.
Thanks very much, Tom. That's very helpful and provides really interesting sort of context. And I think, Australia is a really interesting test case with the different sort of levers and different ways that China might use its coercive tactics, especially in the trade and investment terms. And another interesting thing, and I think it's a good segue to Stephen, where I'll go next, is that Australia's trade relationship is very dependent on China, obviously. And I think this is an interesting segue to Japan too, which has to manage this pragmatic relationship, with Japan still being its #1 trading partner, but also being increasingly concerned in the sort of geostrategic and security sphere of China's actions. So Stephen, if I can turn to you for a little bit, don't feel limited, obviously, to give the Japanese perspective, but because that is where your hat normally resides, I understand you're calling from Canada tonight. I wonder if you can give us a few insights from how the Japanese side has managed this. And this is not just a recent phenomenon. Obviously, this is something Japan has been managing for quite some time with China. That would be very helpful. So Stephen, if I can turn to you, and again, very shortly to introduce you, Stephen. Stephen is a senior associate professor at the International Christian University in Japan, and has a host of different affiliations. If he had a baseball card set, he would have a full set of different affiliations. So I don't have time to list them all now, but suffice to say, Stephen is a great scholar on Japan and on East Asia. So Stephen, over to you to give us a little perspective from Japan.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and it's really great to be in this webinar with Tom and Luke and yourself. Thanks for organizing it. So I think that it's really important for us to bring up this idea of the China paradox when we're thinking about bilateral relations. And what I mean by the China paradox is, even though bilateral relations between China and Japan, or Australia and China, or Canada and China are really at their lowest state, I think, since normalization, with unfavorably ratings really at record lows, that the trade relationship continues to deepen. And this China paradox really is a challenge for Japan and Canada and Australia in terms of how do they deal with the growing assertive behavior in their backyard and in their globally. And coercive diplomacy or hostage diplomacy, or as the Japanese have experienced, they've experienced de facto embargoes of rare earths, destruction and violence against their businesses in first-tier cities in China. And they've also experienced hostage diplomacy, with the latest one being Professor Iwamoto in Hokkaido University, who was returned to Japan in early October, November 2019. So Japan is looking at the bilateral relations with China through this lens of the China paradox, is that they benefit from the bilateral relations. They want to continue to deepen those relations, and it's evidenced by joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and even the peripheral consideration of China joining the Comprehensive, Progressive, and Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan understands clearly that its future will inevitably have a strong economic component with China, and that has to continue to curry favor with leaders at the national level and the local level to ensure that they can remain prosperous. But that being said, Japan has had challenges. It had challenges in 2010 with rare earth embargo after the arrest of a Chinese fisherman by Okinawan authorities. They've had significant trouble in 2012 onward with the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands. And growingly, we have troubles with targeted scholars being arrested in China and imprisoned. And at this stage, there's still 11 imprisoned Japanese scholars and business people. So Canada's not alone in this challenge. Australia is not alone in this challenge. But Japan has been able to navigate this relationship and the coercion, I think, from a position of strength. And what I mean by the position of strength, it continues to deepen its bilateral relationships with the United States, which gives it leverage in pushing back against China on difficult issues. But as Tom mentioned, not only in strengthening its relationship with the United States, it's investing what we call strategic partnerships. And last year's visit by Scott Morrison to Tokyo for one day to sign a commitment to a defense treaty is very illustrative of Japan's thinking about diversifying strategic partnerships within the region. It's further diversifying its position of strength by participating in the Quad, but also investing in what we call multilateral agreements, whether it's the TPP-11, the Japan-EU EPA, Japan-EU Infrastructure and Connectivity Agreement. Japan is negotiating that relationship with Beijing from a comprehensive position of strength that allows it to bring in and anchor other actors into the region to support Japanese interests. So with that, I think the lesson that Japan can teach Australia and Canada and other countries, and I hope we can get into this later in today's webinar, is that we need to broaden our partnerships. We need to be more multilateral in our engagements so that when economic coercion does happen, or other forms of coercion that do happen, that we can rely on those partners and those economic networks and the strategic partnerships to put collective pressure on Beijing to push back against the various kinds of coercion that we're experiencing. In the case of Canada, I think that they demonstrated that hostage diplomacy has declining benefits. When Canada forged a global or a multilateral declaration against arbitrary detentions, really it had reputational costs for China. And those reputational costs for China has made it increasingly difficult for China to find partners on trade. on security issues, on climate change, and other issues. Japan supports that initiative, but Japan has also been, I think, adept at dealing with coercion through backdoor diplomacy, through allowing the Chinese to save face. And I think these are also lessons for Canada and Australia to take home, is that often a face-saving backdoor diplomacy is sometimes a more effective way to deal with coercive diplomacy and other challenges associated with China. And I think that should be an area that Canada, Australia, and Japan continue to coordinate, to think about, and to invest resources as China does become a more critical player in the regional environment. And no doubt that we're going to experience other forms of coercion as I think the US-China competition becomes more intense. Jonathan, I'll stop there so that Luke can jump in and share his thoughts as well, but I look forward to today's exchange. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Very helpful context of the Japanese experience and a bit of the lessons learned, which I think is something I want to go back to later on. I think you're right that Japan has sort of been learning lessons for several decades and centuries in many ways in dealing with China diplomatically. So it has a lot to offer to this discussion. So we'll move back to that, but I'd like to move next to Luke Petey. So Dr. Luke Petey is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute of International Studies and also a Canadian, I believe. So it's a welcome back to Canada, at least temporarily, Luke. And he has written an excellent book titled How China Loses, which he did in-depth research across the Indo-Pacific region and also in Africa and elsewhere, looking at this important topic. And I believe coercive diplomacy is one of your main areas of focus right now. So Luke, thanks again for joining you. It's great that we've got you on our time zone to make this easier. And the floor is yours to give us some perspectives, both on from the Danish side, but more broadly from the European perspective. Clearly, Europe has been dealing with a range of different challenges in dealing with China right now as well. And their investment treaty obviously is frozen or on hold, at least to my understanding, largely because of some of the tit-for-tat sanctions over Xinjiang. So very interested in your perspective, Luke. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be in Canada, and it's a pleasure to be speaking about this subject with Tom and Stephen. I think, when it comes to China's economic coercion in recent years, Europe has largely went unscathed. There was a case with Norway around 10 years ago now. More recently, China has targeted Lithuania with some trade measures after Lithuania announced opening a Taiwan representative office. So there has been some cases, but the trade relationship hasn't been very upset by economic coercion. That said, these cases that have come up in Europe and comparing those with Canada, I think demonstrate a couple similarities that I think are worth recognizing now that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are fortunately home. We can start to think about lessons learned from the coercion that took place. The first general trend, I think, is that the way China uses its trade weapon is often exaggerated initially by both the Chinese and the Western media. So there's a necessity to really unpack exactly how much and what China is targeting and what that means for a targeted country like Canada or Australia, Japan, Korea, because it doesn't really leave a strong imprint on the economies of targeted countries, but more so on particular companies and industries that take the brunt of the damage. For instance, Canada's trade with China has been growing in recent years, despite the upset relations. When it did fall between 18 and 19, it only fell by several $billion. And Canada, is trading in total over $400 billion a year. So it's really a fraction of the trade that, that did fall, mostly in canola and other agricultural products. That only represents a fraction of Canada's total trade. And I think, this points out that, China is concerned about its economic interests too, and they don't want to upset those, even at a small level. And Beijing often strives to do a do no harm approach when it uses economic coercion. It has interests in different industries. It doesn't want to lose access to vital agricultural goods, to vital minerals that it gets from countries like Canada and Australia. So, for instance, pork was one of the products that was initially targeted by China and on Canada. But after several months, these measures were released because China was facing the African swine flu at home, and was, its pig population was wiped out to a large degree. So it needed that trade again. So the same took place with Australian iron ore. China has not targeted iron ore because it really much needed it for its stimulus after COVID began. We see China now buying some coal, even from Australia, which was also targeted because of some power shortage problems in China at the moment. So we see that China has its limits in how it applies economic coercion, and this doesn't mean that there should be there shouldn't be a response. I think I agree with the others that there's a need for a collective response among targeted countries. We see now the EU, for example, is in the early stages of developing an anti-coercion mechanism. So when one member state is targeted, there will be an immediate response from the EU body at large, and that will hopefully deter future use of economic coercion. So there is some gradual steps in the EU to find solutions to ensure that these types of coercion aren't used by China and other major powers in the future. So I'll stop there for now and look forward to the discussion.
Excellent, thanks, Luke. That really provides another great context from the European side on this. I want to, pivot now into the discussion, and a lot there to unpack. But one of the things that I noted that a number of you mentioned, I think all three of you mentioned, in fact, in different terms, is the idea of reputational costs. And I think we would all agree, at least the China of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe the China of today, cares about reputational costs. But it seems increasingly, and Canada's not alone in this regard, those reputational costs are adding up. I think especially if I think about the past 10 years and the relationship with Japan, I think that was more of an own goal for China when it comes to reputational costs than any other relationship, because I think Japan effectively for almost 8 to 10 years was going around the region, ASEAN, South Asia, Europe, etc., sort of discussing the coercion that China is imposing on them. And I think that sort of that story was sort of taken by many, because I think they were feeling the same sort of pressures. So I guess my question is on reputational costs. I would agree with you in principle that China likes saving face and is a country that cares about reputational costs, but it doesn't seem their actions are matching that. Rather than taking on one or two countries at one time, it seems that they're incurring reputational costs across the board. And that strikes me as a little bit different. This is not a diplomatic dispute with Norway, and then China's okay with the rest of the EU, or this is not a diplomatic dispute with just the EU, but is maintaining positive relations with Japan. It seems that the sort of damage is across the board. So to me, that seems a little bit unprecedented in recent times for China. So maybe, Tom, if I can kind of turn to you first on this, whether you agree with that assessment. Obviously, Australia seems, first and front of mind for me in this case. But would you say this is true, that China's sort of acceptance of or tolerance of reputational costs has very much gone up? And if that's the case, why? And do you see any sort of change on that in the coming months?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So, I mean, in terms of the reputational cost to China, I mean, we can absolutely see that now in Australia's responses. I mean, both as I think Stephen had alluded to before, in terms of public opinion. I mean, opinion polls show something like sort of about 90% or something negative views of China in Australia now. And I think, you know, the kind of the economic coercion that Australia has been reeling from is just one of many examples of Chinese so-called assertive behavior in the region that is alienating regional states very quickly and putting them on guard against how Beijing might exercise its power. And of course, one of the things that perhaps that had not been contemplated by the decision makers in Beijing is that, you know, for every action there would be a reaction, and the reaction I think we've seen has been quite robust on Australia's part. So I mean, I'd like to just mention a little bit about how Australia has sort of defied this economic statecraft, to follow on from my opening remarks. But before doing that, just to mention, you know, how in broader terms, not only this economic coercion that everyone around the region is watching towards Australia, but other assertive actions have sort of brought about the renaissance of the quadrilateral strategic dialogue with Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, but also, of course, the unprecedented recent release of the AUKUS agreement, the Australia, UK, US agreement. And so actually, you know, these actions are proving very counterproductive. But it's worth just mentioning something that I kind of sketched over in my opening remarks about how Australia has very much become the sort of the model for resilience and resistance to Chinese economic coercion. So, you know, many states around the region and around the world are looking to Australia to see, well, how did they manage to endure this? Basically, you know, the fact that that Beijing had initially denied there was any connection between, you know, surprisingly 400% you know, tariffs on Australian wine and things like that, and then actually just come out and blatantly said, well, actually, you know, this is because we're very unhappy about your very, very public call for an inquiry into COVID-19. That's what started the whole cycle off, and it sort of speaks to what Luke was talking about, is that Australian has a bit of a tendency to use this kind of megaphone diplomacy rather than this sort of behind the scenes safe face-saving mechanisms and everything. And I think that was why, partly at least, why Beijing chose to sort of make an example of Australia and say, well, you know, if you shout, you know, very loudly, then, you know, we're going to cut you down to size. And then, you know, what actually happened after that very public and sort of insensitive call by Canberra for an inquiry into COVID-19, and then all of the tariffs and various methods of embargo that followed on various Australian products, was that we were provided unofficially with a list of 14 grievances indicating all of the things that we were doing that were wrong or incorrect according to Beijing, and how we would rectify these. But the Australian government was very, very robust in its response to this and said, well, we can't possibly accede to these points because it would compromise our sovereignty, and you know, we'll find a way to deal with whatever economic punishment you can give us. But yeah, certainly in Australia, you know, the reputational costs to China in terms of the perceptions, but also in terms of how it's kind of it's fueled the debate about, well, okay, this is, you know, how China is going to behave. Therefore, there's no debate now about the sort of the constituency in Australia that is sort of more sympathetic to China and the sort of China lobby, if you like, but rather the sort of the security hawks have gained the upper hand in the discourse and in the actions that the governments are taking at the moment. So that's the reaction on Australia's part to being on the receiving end of this coercion.
Thanks a lot, Tom. That's great. And, you know, before I pivot to Stephen and then to Luke, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned. I think it might segue nicely to what they're going to say as well. Your point is well taken, I think, on Australia and their experience. And as you said, sometimes a softer voice and it might garner more benefits. Although one interesting case study, and again, maybe I can turn to Stephen on this to have his perspectives, is South Korea. Because I think if you think of the THAAD experience in 2016, I don't think anyone would accuse the South Koreans of speaking with a a megaphone, or basically saying, they actually very much had value and interest, especially as China's #1 trading partner, to keep this very quiet, to manage the relationship with China very carefully. But still were punished quite severely through coercive measures. Everyone remembers latte shops being sort of being effectively banned in China, and other sort of effective embargoes on South Korean products and tourism, etc. So I think it's a good point, but I also kind of wonder if China feels it's in their interest to use coercive tactics, whether they will do it regardless of the method. So that's one point. The second element, maybe Luke can pick up on this too, with AUKUS. I think that's a very interesting development, and on the idea of reputational costs and whether the Chinese are sort of willing to lend an olive branch out to many of these relationships that they've damaged. AUKUS, from my perspective, if you were a strategic thinker in the Chinese State Council, you would use this as an opportunity to drive that wedge in between the U.S. and the U.K. and the Australia, but also the U.S. and the U.K. in particular, and the European Union, especially obviously with how irate the French are about this deal and some of their previous inclinations to China. I think the Europeans, and Luke, maybe you can comment on this more. I think it's not that simple of a story. I think they also increasingly are growing quite realistic on managing the China relationship. So despite their probably their unease and unhappiness with this recent deal, at least the French side, I don't think that's fundamentally changed how Europe thinks on China. But again, it would seem an opportunity for China to tamp down the tensions with the EU, and then use that to sort of push against arrangements such as AUKUS. So just with those sort of those thoughts, maybe I can turn to Stephen on this issue, and then I'll move to Luke.
So Tom provided some great framework for me to jump in here, and thanks very much, Jonathan, for your additional comments. So I think it's really important for us to contextualize reputational costs, and for every wolf warrior diplomat that we've experienced over the past 2 years, there's 2 or 3 or 4 panda diplomats, and it's very, very important for us to not overshoot this idea of reputational costs globally. I think in advanced Western countries, China's reputation has really tumbled to record lows. But if you go to developing states, Nepal, Sri Lanka, African states, Middle Eastern states, as well as other states, China's reputation is not so bad. Actually, it sits in a much better position. And I think this is really important as we calculate and we reconfigure our approaches to China. We should ensure that we understand that, the relationships with us may be problematic, but they have many other partnerships around the world, and they sell themselves as the champion of emerging states. And this is, I think, a critical point for us to be thinking about. What is the reputational cost globally? Second, who is the CCP? Who is Wolf Warriors really playing to? And I think if we look at the Alaska summit with Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi speaking to Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken, they weren't playing to the United States. They were playing to their domestic audiences, and it sold well. It sold extremely well. And if we look at the return of Ms. Meng Wanzhou to China, no mention of Michael Kovrig, no mention of Michael Spavor, no mention of any kind of deal. The Chinese government has an ability to play these critical issues in a way that I think Western countries or open liberal democratic countries can't, which means that our calculation about reputational costs really need to be based on, I think, a clear understanding of what do the ordinary Chinese people think about the party? What do the elites think about the party? And the elites, I'm specifically thinking about the princeling class, and potentially this as a lever of pressure that we can use to shift China in a different direction, because they do hold the rings of power. And then secondly, thinking about, that broader support that China does have internationally. And I think these are important considerations in thinking about how we craft our policy moving forward. Now, you mentioned South Korea, and I think South Korea is an excellent example of how the failure of, coercive diplomacy. Today, the Chinese have done something absolutely incredible that no other country's been able to do in 70 years. They've made the Chinese more unfavorable in terms of liking than the Japanese and South Korea. And for our audience members, I can't tell you what an amazing feat this is. It deserves a Nobel Prize this week, quite frankly. And I think that this represents the failure of coercive diplomacy in the South Korean context. But pivoting back to that core concept I mentioned, the China paradox. If we want real leverage, then we have to shift. We have to be able to convince our business groups, the American Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Australian Chamber of Commerce, the Keidanren, the Japanese Business Federation in Japan, that the value of investment in China is not worth the effort. And unfortunately or fortunately, all of these chambers really are driving the relationship, driving the political relationship between China and each respective country. And that suggests that, again, policymakers, whether it's Canada, Australia, Japan, have to be really thinking about what is the real reputational costs, who are the real stakeholders, and who do we have to start working with to be more resilient against coercion. And I think that's really, really critical. And those should kind of bookend our understanding and engagement with China.
Thanks, Stephen. I think that's a great segue to you, Luke, to talk a little bit about the Europeans' experience on this. And I mean, if you have any thoughts on the sort of the AUKUS angle that I mentioned, and Tom's sort of initial comments on that, and how that's being perceived in Europe, and whether you feel China would seize an opportunity like that, or whether the domestic audience, as Stephen I think very rightly noted, is the main attention that the Chinese government and these wolf warriors are targeting when they're making their comments. And if that's the case, whether this is just not something that they're willing to compromise on their domestic audience to take advantage of this. So Luke, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Great, thanks. A lot to unpack there. I think, firstly, all politics is local, including in China. And I agree that the domestic audience is where Xi Jinping and China's leadership is primarily focused. They are, of course, aware of big changes in the last 10, 15 years in global affairs. I think, China's confidence as a global power grew after the global financial crisis, did quite some damage to the US economy and Europe as well, very much focused in the West. And secondly, the political instability and infighting that we see in the US. All these things embolden China. And I think targeting countries like Canada or Australia, countries very close to the United States, there's certainly, I think, a crowd in China's political leadership that doesn't mind that their reputation is tarnished in these Western countries. That's I think another thing that we need to realize, that China might not care as much about its reputation as we think. But it's also driving, I think, what Stephen mentioned. It's driving a new relationship with the developing world, and there its reputation is far better. In Africa, there was a recent poll of 18 countries and African countries that found that China was slightly seen better than the US by those polled. But still, those Africans polled also pointed towards the American development model and democracy as the model they would like to follow. So I think it's also important, even with developing countries, that we realize they're not interested in being in the China camp or being in the Western camp. They don't want a camp. They're eager to work with all sorts of partners, regardless of where they come from. And that's why it's important too that the US, Canada, and others continue to engage in Africa and the Middle East and Latin America to ensure that these countries stay open to these views as well. And we also need to mention that China not only upset its reputation with Western countries, it also upset its reputation with the biggest developing country, India, one of the biggest. And this in the 2020 fighting that took place along their shared border was also, I think, one of the biggest blunders, China's foreign policy blunders, in quite some time, that causing the Indians, who were looking towards a warmer relationship with China before that, to really turn on the Chinese and to get more engaged with the Quad partnership with the Americans and Japanese and the Australians. And so where the EU comes, very briefly, I think, in the media, we often hear about the differences between the EU and the American view of China and how to deal with China, and that the American view tends to be more sharp and sees a military security threat, and the Europeans don't. And this is largely true. But if we look at just how the EU's view of China has changed just in the past 5 years, we see some pretty incredible changes underway. The EU, I think, is principally concerned about the industrial competitiveness of their main companies and industries, and they see China increasingly as a challenge, as a competitive threat. It's sort of state-run or largely state-run economy. The subsidies and other state support that its companies get are upsetting European corporate interests, and that's a big deal for Germany and France and other big European economies. And that has caused the EU to be more defensive in its economic relationship with China. And I think, this is something to watch, because unlike, I think, Canada, for example, or other countries, the German Federation of Industries, BDI, is quite sharp when it comes to China, and is quite concerned with the industrial competitiveness of its companies. And that's, I think, something to look at too for the Canadian side, is the competition with the Chinese outside of coercion, but just the sort of industrial competition and the necessity to rework the WTO, to work alongside the EU to ensure that there's a level playing field for Canadian and European industries. And so Europe, I think, is very much focused on the economic relationship. And there are particular companies that are driving European leaders to be less critical of China. But there are many, many companies, small and medium-sized enterprises, which make up the majority of Europe's economy, that are quite concerned about unfair trade practices coming from the Chinese side. So I think we'll see that drive the relationship in the coming years.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Your thoughts make me think about something that I'd been wanting to bring up at the early part of the discussion. I think now is a good time to do it, and thinking about some of the measures that that states can work on together to manage some of these risks, and particularly on the economic side. So I want to stay on the economic side right now and look at economic security. So this is something, and perhaps Stephen can touch on this. Japan, I believe, has just introduced its first ever minister to be focused precisely on this issue. And I think countries individually are looking at this issue quite a bit. And I think collectively, I think, Luke, you mentioned the Quad, and others have as well. I think increasingly alignments such as the Quad are starting to look at supply chains and economic security issues as well. But it seems we're still a little bit behind the 8 ball in dealing with this. So is this something that can or should effectively be dealt with in a sort of a minilateral dynamic? Multilaterally, I think it can be addressed as well, but probably not as effectively. Is this something that you think, and this doesn't need to be China specific, I think this is something more broadly as states think about economic coercion, economic threats, and seeing the interlinkages between economics and security. Is this something that can be done? And if so, what context what's the right sort of arrangement to deal with this? Is this something that should be in the Five Eyes, the Five Eyes Plus, including some of the key European states? Is this something that the Quad should be leading on? Where do you guys see the best way to deal with this in tandem with partners? So maybe if I can, return to you, Luke, first to talk on this, and then I'll go to Stephen and Tom.
Sure. I think that there's mutual learning that can take place. We see the EU has just launched an Indo-Pacific strategy. Australia was, of course, early out of the gates, as was Japan, with viewing Asia sort of beyond China, that there are other economic opportunities and strategic interests in Asia beyond the Chinese center of that regional economy. And that's, principally, I think, something that Canada needs to strongly consider, looking at growth opportunities in India and in Southeast Asia in particular, and speaking with the Europeans, the Australians, the Japanese, and others who have already hatched their own strategies on engaging a wider Asia, on bringing that focus to a wider Asia, because that allows a country to be able to pivot when they do face economic coercion. If the canola industry in Canada is too heavily dependent on China, then it needs to find breakthrough opportunities elsewhere in Asia that will make any sort of future economic coercion less impactful. And it's about sort of unpacking your economic relationships with China, seeing where you're prone, where you have heavy dependencies, and then seeing what other countries are out there that might offer opportunities to diversify. There's also been discussions about having sort of an economic Article 5, similar to what NATO has on the economic front, so that if one country is targeted economically, there will be a response, an economic response from allies. There have been also discussions of having a joint fund between countries that will help industries that are targeted in partner countries. And all these actions, including the EU's anti-coercion plan, are meant to deter China or others from using such tools in the future. So those are just a few ideas that I think are floating out there and need to be sort of translated to a certain degree into policy.
Great, thanks a lot, Luke. Maybe I'll pivot to Stephen now, and if you can pick up on that thread of Japan's new cabinet and having an economic security and minister in place, and obviously it's been something Japan's been putting a great deal of attention to even before the new government. But what are your thoughts on this, Stephen?
So I'm going to try and unpack this and make it as brief as possible. But I think from Japan's perspective, the biggest challenge they've had is to maintain what we call the separation of politics and economics from their relationship with China. And growingly, beginning, I think, in the mid-1990s, but it's become increasingly more difficult to maintain that relationship. And I think that we've seen that, whether it's 2010 with the rare earth embargo that I mentioned, or the 2012 nationalization of the Senkaku Islands. Japan's really been at the forefront, I think, of economic coercion vis-a-vis China. And their economic security thinking has been driven by that. But I want to make sure and drive home the point that Japan's thinking about economic security, while driven by China, is not only driven by China's assertive behavior. I think COVID-19 has been a black swan event and really driven home the message that Japan needs to selectively diversify its supply chains away from China. And I keep using very explicit words like selectively diversify. So things like technology, things like other special technologies that are specifically related to the Japanese economy. And here I'm thinking about semiconductors that are produced by the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. But Japan's also thinking about diversifying within China, because what we saw in the COVID outbreak is that Wuhan shut down, and Wuhan's a center of Japanese pharmaceutical manufacturing, car manufacturing, other manufacturing. From the Japanese business perspective, they also need to diversify within China. If, let's say, Guangzhou had a capacity to take up what was shut down in the Wuhan area, then we wouldn't have seen so many disruptions in supply chains. So Japan's thinking is really quite, I think, nuanced. It's diversify within China and diversify from China, and starting to move production networks closer to areas where new consumer markets are being developed. And we see that with Southeast Asia. We see that with South Asia by building production networks northeast of Delhi and building infrastructure from Kolkata to Mumbai. So Japan's economic security thinking is really driven by politics, but also by, I think, non-traditional security issues, as I mentioned, black swan events like COVID-19. But lastly, I think it's also driven by the behavior of the United States under the former administration. The economic coercion didn't just come from China. It came from the United States under that administration. And I think this was a lesson that Japan needs to strengthen its relationships with the United States, pull the United States further into the region in various kinds of economic partnerships, and forge even deeper bilateral relations to ensure that a potential another America First administration doesn't coerce Japan or Canada or other states in the same way that the former administration did. So I look at economic coercion and economic statecraft, again, from those three areas. It's not all driven by China. And I think that's a kind of an important point for us to take home as well.
That's a great point, Stephen, and I think sort of debunks the notion that I think a lot of us would agree with, that there's some easy decoupling that's possible. I think your mention of selective or targeted, which I think I would agree with, and I would also say evolving. This is something that is gradual. This is not something that's meant to be a 1 to 3 to 6 month project and ends with no investment or no trade with China, but I think is very targeted in the most sensitive sectors. And I think that's probably the case in Australia too. So Tom, I'd move to you on this, on economic security, and also sort of add on the question on the discussion on the Quad, but also from an alliance perspective, obviously Australia being a key US ally. How does economic security sort of nest inside alliance concerns? Is this something that realistically we can see the Quad meaningfully address in coming years? We know that they're starting to touch on supply chains and things like this, but how do you see Australia outside of, well, number one, on its own domestic scale looking at this, but also in tandem with its US ally and these sort of unilateral alignments? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So actually, to perhaps give a broad comment and then a more specific one. So the broad one, going back to what Stephen had said and what I alluded to in my opening remarks about this idea that economics and security could be compartmentalized or had been viewed in that way, and that was official government policy in Australia, as I mentioned. But now I think what we're seeing is, some academics have talked about a dual hierarchy in the Indo-Pacific, with the United States at the head of the security hierarchy and China at the head of the economic hierarchy, and this creating enormous dilemmas, especially for middle powers like Australia and Canada, and how they manage this economic kind of strategic disconnect. But at the same time that they face that problem, the other thing that, and I think Stephen touched on this a little bit, is that the economic chessboard and the security chessboard or silos, like they're no longer separate anymore. The walls have broken down between these compartments, and this has been a sort of a gradual process where you've seen, originally it was all about purely confined to economic interaction with China, and we'll just keep the alliances going on in the background, never mind who they might be targeted against, and we can keep those compartmentalized. But China itself has changed the landscape in the Indo-Pacific region through the use of its very explicit use of economic coercion in order to advance its political and security aims, or to send signals on that score, and also the way that it's built its own kind of hybrid architecture, first through economic architecture like AIIB and everything, and then BRI. But then BRI actually sort of, has a sort of economic security or even, broader security element to it. And certainly things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is this sort of hybrid mix of security and economics. And so the landscape within which countries operate within the Indo-Pacific has changed with this wall between economics and security breaking down. And so this is definitely reflected in the salience of economic security for Australia. Some of the things that both Luke and Stephen touched upon. So, we're really thinking now, and partly this is stimulated by the COVID pandemic and the interruption of supply chains that were, obviously not premeditated, but then the deliberate use of economic coercion. So there's kind of two drivers to that. So diversifying supply chains, also having more national resilience in terms of building things domestically or manufacturing things domestically and so forth. And then to get to your point, Jonathan, about the the use of sort of partnerships, multilaterals, alliances, and everything to expedite this kind of diversification strategy. Australia is actually, if you look at what Australia and Japan are doing in their strategic partnership, and you look at their annual summit press releases, there's a whole section now on economic security that we both recognise that economic security is a massive priority, and we'll do as much to help each other on these scores. And there's been a lot of encouraging comments from the Japanese ambassador Yamagami-san here in Australia about how Japan will help Australia build resilience. And so one of the things that they've been doing that is sort of a fairly concrete example of this is exploring how Australia can develop its rare earth metals industry with, I think, Japanese and probably American assistance as well, to kind of to guard against the similar sort of thing that Stephen pointed out, which was the suspension of rare earth exports from China, which produces most of the world's, and to a secure supplier and a friend and ally in Australia. Actually, another thing that just sort of related to this as well is just the furious activity that's going on behind the China Plus strategy that's just been announced by the Treasury, Josh Friedberg here, to Australian industry, is to diversify to different partners, and it's often India and Vietnam that tend to be the ones that really kind of grab the attention as not being perfect substitutes for China by any means, but being tangible potential new economic partners. And we've seen that actually. One thing that's worth perhaps just mentioning specifically is Australian tertiary education. So some universities in Australia were reliant upon Chinese enrollments to a very, very high degree. I mean, so 30% of their 30% of their enrollments were mainland students. And of course, because of all of the diplomatic spat and the fact that the Chinese government actually issued warnings to Chinese students that they're potentially subject to violence if they come to Australia, has really dampened that market down, apart from COVID. So now you've seen, and I've just noticed this with my own university, is a huge emphasis on trying to attract Indian and Vietnamese students to make up the numbers. So I mean, that's just one small example. But then it also segues into more sort of serious security, sort of strategic, military security concerns, where Australia is now saying, well, we need to develop our own arms industry indigenously now as well, to create more national resilience and have more control over our defence industrial base. So there's plans to set up indigenous missile manufacture here. And this is all part of what I think is very closely aligned to these debates on economic security, which is where it comes full circle and comes back to sort of military security, but it is these emerging disruptive technologies. And so research into things like AI, machine learning, hypersonics, quantum computing, all of these kind of things. This is where a lot of the kind of the economic security overlaps with the broader kind of military or strategic security, and whether or not these things will go on within I've given the example of the Japan-Australia strategic partnership as being one way you're seeing collaboration, but you're also seeing collaboration on a trilateral context with the United States, with Trilateral Investment Fund to provide alternatives to the BRI in the South Pacific, and I think there's a number of things that are happening in this space, and so we need to see how those evolve.
Thanks a lot, Tom. I'm just going to quickly move to Stephen, who I think has a follow-on comment on that before wrapping up and having one last question to everyone. So Stephen, please.
Thanks. And Tom started to talk about AUKUS, and I want to put AUKUS in terms of the context of economic security. And although I think that most of the debate has been talking about the deterrence capabilities of AUKUS, I think what's actually somewhat even more important is what's going to happen between the UK, the United States, and Australia in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of bolstering each other's research and development, in terms of academic exchanges, in terms of creating new industries, as Tom mentioned, whether it's quantum computing, AI, likely semiconductors. All of this is going to help Australia and the UK and the United States selectively diversify and reshuffle their economic portfolio with regards to China. And I think it's going to superpower the economies in many ways and build new industries, which I think is great for Australia. Now, just linking that, and I'll just be brief because I know Luke will jump in on this as well, is that because Canada and Japan are not part of AUKUS doesn't mean we're not part of this package. The AI development, quantum computing, all of this, we have first-rate institutions that we can work with the Australians and the British and the United States. So what, in effect, these countries have done is they've created a trusted group of like-minded countries to develop the next economies that are interlinked with like-minded, trusted partners. And I think that is really, really critical when we're thinking about the economic security argument, not just from a unilateral standpoint, but a multilateral, as Jonathan mentioned, minilateral form of cooperation moving forward. And I'll stop there because I'm really interested in Luke's comments as well.
Luke, did you have anything to add on that before we move to kind of a final round?
Thanks. Very briefly on the technology front, I mean, I agree with Tom and Stephen on economic security. I think it's also important that everyone recognizes that it is not only the US or only China that are driving technology, future technologies. I mean, Japan, Korea, and the EU have their places, and therefore can and should cooperate more closely, including on 5G telecommunication technology. Right, we're close to Denmark, in Finland and Sweden. We have some of the leading telecom companies in Ericsson and Nokia. The Japanese and the Koreans, in particular, the Koreans have Samsung, and these are areas where middle powers like the EU, like Japan, need to cooperate more closely, because countries are not moving away from China on 5G if they are very dependent on Chinese aid to build that technology or Chinese finance to build that technology. And therefore, I think it's important that Europeans and East Asians outside of China also look at opportunities to spread that technology and their capabilities across the developing world.
That's really interesting, Luke. Thank you for that. And I think it's a really important point, Stephen, that you made also on AUKUS, that it's not necessarily an exclusionary club on some of the themes that they're focused on. And not only Canada and Europe, but I think, as Luke just referenced, there's not a monopoly when it comes to some of the technology in the region, and other U.S. allies and partners, including Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, I would include in that, would be very much in that group. And I mean, maybe we will be expanding this very already awkward acronym AUKUS into something else. Maybe it'll be JAUKUS with Japan involved, and a double emphasized K with Korea involved as well. I know there's many here in Canada who also wish they would have a name in that acronym as well. So we'll see how this alignment evolves in the coming days. So I want to end off, so we don't have a whole lot of time right now left, but I did want to end off on the point of Canada. And again, I've learned a lot from the different insights and lessons learned. We've talked about that and perspectives. But let's look at this 3-year episode that Canada's gone through with the two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou. And I'd like to stress a caveat at the beginning, and I think this would probably be shared throughout this panel, that the challenges that Canada faced in the China relationship preceded the issue with Meng Wanzhou and Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. So while this was a sort of very glaring and an obvious case, I think, for the Canadian public, and China's sort of public perception in Canada very much has gone down after this incident, these challenges pre-existed. But I guess my question would be, and I fully take the point on quiet diplomacy and the idea that sometimes that can, produce more dividends in the relationship with China than sort of megaphone diplomacy, I think, as others have mentioned. But I guess if you are making advice to a senior Canadian policymaker, what would be, number one, the lesson on where to go from here in the relationship with China? In a situation like this, what lesson would you learn? Would you learn the lesson that it is better to now try to change China's approach, try to change China's mind on its tactics, secondary to accept those tactics, to sort of acquiesce to those tactics, and have a sort of a quieter approach. The third one is to manage them, to find a way to just manage these, whether it's unilaterally or minilaterally or multilaterally. And I guess, finally, and I think this is core to the way I think about this, is how strategically should we be positioning ourselves after an episode such as this? From my own perspective, I think that strategic framework needs to be placing China, or nesting China, and nesting the management of that relationship within a broader strategy for the Indo-Pacific. So rather than prioritizing and agonizing over how to deal with China on certain tactical issues, I think we should be nesting that into a broader approach to this region, which I think all three of you have mentioned, that by having strategic partnerships, I think Stephen mentioned this at the onset, in building those strategic partnerships proactively, you have a chance to mitigate some of these risks. You can't erase the possibility of it, but you can mitigate them before they happen. You have, in a sense, a playbook or a game plan before these sort of creep up on you on some unfortunate day in December. So again, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what Canada should take away from this. What would be a good approach for Canada to think about? And you can include your own perspectives on how that might involve Japan, how that might involve Australia, and how that might involve our friends in Europe. So if I can start with Tom, and then I'll move on to Stephen and Luke.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, in terms of giving policy advice to the Canadian government or other governments, I mean, it's one thing to plan to do something and plan to respond in a way, with a various package of measures or stances. But I think I'll leave that to the other two speakers. But what immediately popped into my own mind was what will actually happen in the aftermath of this, which is basically China will become, will be less visited, especially by Canadians, but also Australians and many others. I think, it probably won't affect, other countries around the world, but ones that have been very specifically burnt by these detention issues. And so, this comes back to the reputational costs again. The number of people that will actually be or actually desire to visit China for academic exchange, for business, even for tourism, is just going to fall through the floor, because people will now determine that there's a serious risk in visiting China, that something could happen to them, that they could get caught up in these diplomatic sort of hostage games. And this is really, this is bad for everybody. This will be the outcome, regardless of what the plan is, because no longer will you have Australian or Canadian academics and think tankers visiting China and interacting with their counterparts and having those channels of dialogue and giving China a window out into the world and us a window into China. But in fact, these channels will all be shut down, which will just simply create more sort of suspicion and lack of knowledge about what's going on within China, and vice versa. So I think that will be the outcome, and that's where the reputational costs of engaging in strategies like this. I mean, hopefully they won't do it again, but it's going to take a long time for people to forget that, and people will think twice before visiting China because of the experience of the Michaels and other Australians and Japanese. So that's what I think the actual outcome will be, regardless of what policies are adopted.
That's a really good point, Tom. And I'll move to Stephen, but I did want to pick up on something that you mentioned. And I would say this is definitely the case in Canada, and I believe Stephen also referred to South Korea public opinion on China, which I think I would agree is remarkable, that public opinion is soured so much that it's below Japan. So that is a remarkable achievement. But the way I would frame this too is that I don't see this as a hiccup in reputational costs, at least for countries like Canada. I mean, this was some of the public opinion on China was skewing quite negative before this incident. I think this has sort of moved this into trench phase. So it's not to say it could never recover and that this is multi-generational, but there is a lot of work to do. And I don't think Canada's alone in this to sort of recover some of those reputational costs. So that's something I think to keep in mind. I want to move to Stephen now briefly, and then we'll close with Luke. So Stephen.
So I see, I guess, this in three ways. The first level is that Canada needs to balance opportunity and the challenges associated with the relationship. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, despite record lows in unfavorable ratings, trade is up 30% in some fields in Japan, in Canada. So there's an opportunity there that Canada needs to continue to engage in, but we have to manage the challenges. Based on that kind of initial framing, what do we need to do? And my message is build resilience and re-engage. Now, how do we do that? And building resilience is going to come through, I think, placing our China policy within a broader Indo-Pacific strategy. And again, this reflects, I think, the lessons that Japan can teach us in terms of its comprehensive strengths that allow it to deal with China in unique ways that, let's say, the Australians and the Canadians can't. It has its alliance partnership. It has strategic partnerships. It's working with the Quad. It's open to working with China on infrastructure connectivity as long as it follows those four levels. So we need to create that strategy that we're having broad interactions in the Indo-Pacific based on our national interests. How do we do this? It's re-engagement through an Indo-Pacific strategy or vision based on creating Indo-Pacific specialists. We need more people that don't just understand China, but also understand China within the broader context of the Indo-Pacific. We need more experts in Canada that speak Mandarin, that speak Indonesian, that speak Hindi, that speak Japanese, that speak Korean, and speak maybe 2 or 3 of those languages. Because by integrating our collective understanding, we can make better decisions and inform our policymakers of how this region works and what are the patterns of behavior. Part of that education strand here, I think we could take a lesson from our Australian friends and their mass culture. Australia has great programs about China-Australia relations, whether it's Pine Gap, whether it's Secret City, and whether it's the news program on ABC with Stan Grant. I think it's called China Tonight or China Weekly. These are great programs that are informing the public in a nuanced way about the issues within the region. And here I think the Australians are far ahead of the Canadians in understanding what's happening in the region through not only mainstream media, but also through popular culture. And I think these are some ways that we can better create literacy about the region, literacy about China, to help us engage in a more thoughtful, nuanced way moving forward.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think your point on the cultivation of talent and literacy in the region is well taken. And I would add to that, in addition to sort of having that sort of cultivation of talent and recruiting that talent, there has to be sort of an optimization of that talent. So essentially using that talent. And I think at least a couple of you mentioned during tonight's discussion the role of the private sector and it's not necessarily the government's job to educate the private sector, but to have an exchange of ideas from both sides. And I think that's something, again, I can't speak to the regional perspectives that you're all representing, but I think from the Canadian context has been lacking, is having that sort of open exchange and having the sort of process where you can have that sort of dialogue between both sides. So Luke, the last word is yours. So I give you 3 or 4 minutes to finish up and your perspectives there on this topic, on how Canada should look at this experience.
Sure, thanks. I think the former Chinese ambassador to Canada offered the wisest advice early on in the Kovrig Spavor affair, when he warned the Canadian government, and I think Minister Freeland at the time, not to work with other countries in pushing back against these detentions at the time. That's the best advice, I think, for Canada, is exactly to do the opposite and to work with other countries and to continue these collective action against arbitrary detention, against economic coercion, whether it comes from China or in the future the Americans or other countries that place pressure on Canada and its allies. And it's to look past the red herring that is decoupling, that we're not in the process of decoupling from China. There's selective decoupling, as Stephen mentioned, in technology and research cooperation and critical infrastructure, and that may need to happen. We're going to have to reassess the value that comes out of trade and investment with China that drives jobs in Canada. We're going to have to weigh that against foreign and security policy goals. There's no question about it. This is a tough decision to take. But these decisions will be made easier if we also recognize that just as Canada needs China for trade, for climate issues, China also needs Canada. China needs Canada's agricultural goods. China needs Canada's energy in the coming years. I think that's what we've learned from the economic coercion from China in different countries, is that China also needs these targeted countries. The last point I'll make is to not sort of have a China-only strategy, and I agree with you that we need to nest in the wider region of the Indo-Pacific and focus on what other countries in the region, other Asian countries, what they want, not devising policies that undermine China necessarily, but focusing on what these other countries want. What do the Indians want to do with Canada? What do the Vietnamese want to do with Canada? And so on. And that, I think, will be the best strategy for Canada's interests moving forward.
I think that's a fantastic point, Luke, and that's a good sort of point to end on, and a point that I often make here when talking about how Canada should be thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. I think this is, frankly, something that would be true with all bilateral relationships or regional relationships, is that it's always going to be a balance. Of course, any country needs to do things that are and have a foreign policy that's in their own interests and in line with their values. But very much it needs to be, there needs to be empathy on that too. And they need to know what their partners and their allies also want. What sort of Canada does the Indo-Pacific want? What sort of Canada do countries within the Indo-Pacific want? And I think, how does that match up with our interests and values? I think it's a really important point. So the good takeaway of this is that we're not alone on these issues, as I think this conversation highlights, that this is something that is not a one country issue or a one-off issue with one country, but this is something that a lot of countries are facing. And I think there are no easy solutions, but I think we talked about a lot of the important ones tonight. So again, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. Tom, all the way from Australia, Stephen and Luke, thanks again for joining this discussion. And I'm sure that we'll have an opportunity to have part 2, 3, 4, and 5, and maybe we can think of new acronyms for AUKUS as well in the meantime. Okay, thanks everyone, and good night to our viewers.
Thanks, Emma, for hosting. Thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you, Tom and Luke. Look forward to the next discussion.